The first rays of dawn cast long shadows across Socorro, New Mexico, as Harriet Gaines struggled against her father's iron grip while he dragged her toward the small whitewashed church at the edge of town. Her wedding dress, hastily altered from her mother's yellowing gown, caught on cacti and stones as she fought with every ounce of strength remaining in her exhausted body. "I will not marry him, father. You cannot force me," Harriet cried, her voice hoarse from a night of pleading. George Gaines, once a respected rancher whose fortunes had dwindled with the drought, tightened his hold on her arm. "You'll do as you're told, girl." Vernon Blackwell's the richest man in the territory, and his offer to clear our debts in exchange for your hand is the only thing keeping us from ruin. He's 49 years old. Harriet protested, tears streaming down her face, smudging the rouge her mother had applied in their cramped bedroom just before sunrise. "And cruel, you've seen how he treats his ranch hands. Age brings wisdom," her father muttered, avoiding her eyes. "And wealth brings comfort. Something you've never known, but soon will." Behind them, Harriet's mother followed silently, head bowed, clutching a small bouquet of wilting desert flowers. The year was 1882, and in Socorro, a daughter's duty to her family superseded her own wishes. Especially when that family teetered on the brink of financial collapse. Harriet had spent her 22 years dreaming of love, devouring the few romance novels that made their way to this dusty corner of the territory. She'd imagined a husband who would cherish her spirit, not break it. Vernon Blackwell, with his cold eyes and wandering hands, had made his intentions clear during his brief courtship. She would be a possession, nothing more. As they approached the church, Harriet saw the small gathering of townsfolk more curious onlookers than well-wishers. Vernon stood at the entrance, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the simple attire of the locals. His thin lips curved into what might have been a smile but reminded Harriet of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "Ah, my reluctant bride arrives," Vernon called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Several of his ranch hands laughed, their eyes following Harriet with a mixture of pity and interest that made her skin crawl. The pastor, a thin man with perpetual dust on his shoulders, shuffled his feet uncomfortably. Even he seemed to recognize the wrongness of this union, though not enough to refuse the generous donation Vernon had made to the church building fund. "Let's proceed," Vernon said, reaching for Harriet's arm to pull her from her father's grasp. Harriet felt something break inside her. This couldn't be happening. She wouldn't let it happen. With a sudden burst of desperation, she wrenched away from both men and stumbled backward, her wedding dress tearing at the hem. "I will not be sold like cattle," she shouted, no longer caring about propriety. Several women in the crowd gasped at her outburst. Vernon's face darkened. "You'll do as you're told, girl. I've paid good money for you." He nodded to two of his men who stepped forward to grab her. That's when the sound of hoofbeats pounded through the morning air. All heads turned as a cloud of dust approached from the main road, revealing a lone rider on a magnificent chestnut stallion. The horse reared dramatically as the rider pulled to a stop before the church. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing himself to be tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were trail-worn but well kept, the mark of a man who took pride in himself despite the hardships of frontier life. A star-shaped badge glinted on his chest. "This wedding's over," he announced, his voice carrying the natural authority of a lawman. Vernon stepped forward, his hand twitching near his holstered pistol. "This ain't your business, stranger. The name's Owen Calloway, U.S. Marshal," the newcomer replied calmly. "And forcing a woman to marry against her became my business the moment I rode into town and heard about it." Harriet stared at the marshal, scarcely believing what was happening. His arrival seemed like something from one of her novels, too perfect, too timely. Yet here he stood, tall and resolute, a living barrier between her and a lifetime of misery. "There's no law against arranged marriages in the territory," Vernon snarled, looking to Harriet's father for support. Marshal Calloway's eyes never left Vernon's face. "True enough, but there are laws against using threats and coercion to settle debts. And I've heard some interesting stories about how you've been conducting business, Mr. Blackwell." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vernon Blackwell's wealth had bought him influence throughout the county, but rumors of his methods had always circulated, threatening ranchers with violence if they didn't sell their land, manipulating water rights, even rustling cattle from those who defied him. "Lies and jealousy," Vernon scoffed. "I'm a businessman. Now step aside, lawman. This is a private ceremony." "Not anymore." The marshal's hand rested casually near his holstered Colt. "Miss, do you wish to marry this man?" he asked, addressing Harriet directly. Before she could answer, her father intervened. "She has no choice. We owe Mr. Blackwell a considerable sum." "I was asking the lady," Marshal Calloway said, his voice softening as he looked at Harriet. "Well, miss," Harriet straightened her shoulders, finding strength in the marshal's steady presence. "No, I do not wish to marry him. Not now, not ever." The marshal nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "Then there will be no wedding today." Vernon's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. I own half the judges in the territory." "Perhaps," Marshal Calloway replied, "but I answer to federal authority, Mr. Blackwell. And I've been tracking your activities for some time now." He turned to address the gathered townsfolk. "This ceremony is concluded. I suggest you all return to your homes." People began to disperse, many whispering excitedly about the dramatic turn of events. Vernon, realizing he was losing control of the situation, made a fatal mistake. His hand darted toward his pistol. "I wouldn't," the marshal warned, already drawing his own weapon with lightning speed. Vernon froze, his hand hovering above his holster. After a tense moment, he let his arm fall to his side. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Not by a long shot." "For today it is," Marshal Calloway replied. He turned to Harriet, who still stood in shock at the sudden change in her circumstances. "Miss, I think it would be best if you came with me for now, for your safety." Harriet's mother stepped forward. "Where will you take her?" "To the sheriff's office until we sort this matter out," he answered. "She'll be safe there." Harriet's father sputtered with indignation. "You have no right to interfere in family matters. The girl doesn't belong to anyone," Marshal Calloway interrupted. "And if you've entered into some illegal arrangement with Blackwell, you might want to consider your next words carefully." George Gaines fell silent, the implications sinking in. Vernon and his men had already mounted their horses and were riding back toward his ranch, no doubt to regroup and plan their next move. The marshal offered his hand to Harriet. "If you'll come with me, miss." Harriet hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, and his touch was gentle as he helped her mount his horse. She settled sideways on the saddle, awkwardly arranging her torn wedding dress. "We'll send for your things," the marshal told her parents. "And I'll be having a long conversation with both of you later." With that, he swung up behind Harriet and urged his horse toward town. Harriet was acutely aware of his strong arm around her waist, steadying her as they rode. After the terror of the morning, this strange intimacy with a man she just met should have frightened her. Instead, she felt oddly safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her words nearly lost in the wind, but Marshal Calloway heard her. "No need for thanks. Just doing my job, miss." "Harriet," she said. "Harriet Gaines." "Well, Miss Gaines," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "It seems you've had quite a morning." "The best terrible morning of my life," she admitted, surprising herself with a small laugh. The marshal chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. "Let's hope the rest of your day improves." As they rode into Socorro, people stopped to stare at the unusual sight of the marshal with a woman in a wedding dress on his horse. Harriet felt a blush creeping up her cheeks, but she held her head high. For the first time in months, she felt free. The sheriff's office was a modest adobe building on the main street. Sheriff Jenkins, a grizzled veteran of the frontier with a perpetual tobacco stain in his gray beard, looked up in surprise as they entered. "Owen Calloway," he exclaimed, rising to his feet. "Didn't expect to see you back in Socorro so soon." "Change of plans," the marshal replied, helping Harriet to a chair. "We need to talk, Tom, and we need a safe place for Miss Gaines here." Sheriff Jenkins eyed Harriet's wedding dress and raised an eyebrow. "I see, Blackwell's bride-to-be, if I'm not mistaken." "Not anymore," Harriet said firmly. The two lawmen exchanged a significant look. "Tell me everything," the sheriff said, settling back into his chair. Over the next hour, Marshal Calloway explained the situation, occasionally asking Harriet to fill in details about Vernon's dealings with her father. The marshal revealed that he'd been investigating Blackwell for months, suspecting him of land fraud, extortion, and possibly worse. "The wedding was my opportunity to confront him publicly," the marshal explained. "Draw him out where he couldn't hide behind his money and influence." "And you used me as bait?" Harriet asked, suddenly understanding why his arrival had been so perfectly timed. The marshal had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Not exactly. I'd planned to intervene, but I didn't know until I arrived in town last night that the situation was so immediate." Sheriff Jenkins snorted. "Owen's got a habit of charging in like the cavalry when there's a damsel in distress." "I do not," Marshal Calloway protested, but there was a hint of color beneath his tan. Harriet found herself studying him more carefully. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so. His dark hair had a slight wave to it, and a thin scar ran along his jawline. There was something in his gray eyes that spoke of both hardness and compassion, a man who'd seen the worst of humanity but hadn't surrendered his belief in its better nature. "Where will I stay?" Harriet asked, suddenly realizing she couldn't return home. Not with her father's anger and Vernon's threats hanging over her. "My sister runs a boarding house at the edge of town," Sheriff Jenkins offered. "Respectable place, mostly school teachers and widows. She'll take you in." "I can't pay," Harriet admitted. "I have nothing of my own." Marshal Calloway waved away her concern. "Consider it part of witness protection. The U.S. Marshal's office will cover your expenses until this matter with Blackwell is resolved." Relief washed over Harriet, followed quickly by a new anxiety. "And how long will that be?" The lawman exchanged another look. "Hard to say," the marshal admitted. "Men like Blackwell don't go down easily, but I won't leave Socorro until he's facing justice." Something in his tone made Harriet believe him. This wasn't just another case to Owen Calloway. There was a personal investment in his determination, something she couldn't quite place. "For now," Sheriff Jenkins said, "let's get you settled at Martha's place. You could probably use some rest after this morning's excitement." Harriet nodded gratefully. The emotional strain of the day was catching up with her, leaving her exhausted. "I'd like to change out of this dress," she said, plucking at the torn and dusty fabric. "I'll have someone fetch your things from your parents' home," the sheriff promised. "In the meantime, I'm sure Martha can find you something suitable." As they prepared to leave for the boarding house, Marshal Calloway hesitated. "I should warn you, Miss Gaines, Vernon Blackwell isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. He'll try to retaliate, perhaps against your family." "They made their choice," Harriet said, surprised by the hardness in her own voice. Then she softened. "But I wouldn't want harm to come to them, despite everything." "I'll assign a deputy to keep an eye on their ranch," Sheriff Jenkins assured her. Outside, the marshal's horse waited patiently. "It's not far to Martha's place," he said, offering his hand to help Harriet mount. "We can walk if you prefer." The thought of walking through town in her ruined wedding dress made Harriet cringe. "Riding would be faster," she said. Once again, she found herself in the strange intimacy of sharing a saddle with Marshal Calloway. This time, however, she was more conscious of his presence, the clean scent of him beneath the trail dust, the careful way he kept his arm around her waist, protective but respectful. "Have you been a marshal long?" she asked, trying to distract herself from these unsettling observations. 5 years now," he replied. "Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a spell, and before that," there was a slight pause, "I grew up on a small ranch in West Texas." Nothing special. Something in his tone suggested there was more to that story, but Harriet didn't press. Everyone in the West had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss. She certainly did. The boarding house was a well-kept 2-story adobe building with a small garden struggling valiantly against the New Mexico heat. Martha Jenkins proved to be a robust, no-nonsense woman with kind eyes that belied her brisk manner. "So you're the bride who wasn't," she said, looking Harriet up and down. "Good for you, girl. Better to wear rags than marry a snake like Vernon Blackwell." Harriet found herself warming to the woman immediately. Thank you for taking me in, Mrs. Jenkins. Miss Jenkins, the woman corrected. Never found a man worth changing my name for, and call me Martha. We don't stand on ceremony here. Inside, the boarding house was clean and modestly furnished. Martha showed Harriet to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. It's not fancy, but it's private. Bathrooms down the hall, meals are at 7, noon, and 6. Any questions? When might I expect my belongings? Harriet asked, looking down at her ruined dress. I'll send someone over right away, Marshal Calloway promised from the doorway. In the meantime, perhaps Martha has something you could borrow, Martha nodded. I'm sure one of the other ladies will have something that fits. You rest now, child. You've had quite a day. After they left, Harriet sank onto the narrow bed, emotions finally overwhelming her. She'd escaped a fate worse than death, being tied forever to a man she despised. But what now? She had no money, no skills beyond the basic education and household management her mother had taught her. And she'd defied not only Vernon Blackwell but her own father. There would be consequences. She knew that as surely as she knew the sun would rise tomorrow, but for the first time in months, she could breathe freely. And somehow, the image of Marshal Owen Calloway's steady gray eyes gave her courage. He'd stood against Vernon when no one else would. Perhaps she could be equally brave in facing her uncertain future. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Martha, arms full of clothing. One of my boarders is about your size. Said you're welcome to borrow these until your things arrive. That's very kind, Harriet said, taking the simple but clean dress, undergarments, and even a pair of sturdy boots. The marshal asked me to tell you he'll return this evening to check on you, Martha added, a knowing twinkle in her eye. He seems quite concerned for your welfare. Harriet felt a blush rising. He's just doing his job. Martha made a non-committal sound that suggested she thought otherwise. Dinner's at 6. Rest until then if you like. Alone again, Harriet quickly changed out of the wedding dress, folding it carelessly and shoving it under the bed. The borrowed dress was plain calico, but it felt like the finest silk after the constricting wedding gown. She lay down on the bed, intending only to rest for a moment, but exhaustion claimed her immediately. She awoke to the sound of raised voices downstairs. Disoriented, Harriet sat up, realizing with a start that several hours had passed. The light coming through her window had shifted to the golden hue of late afternoon. The voices grew louder. With a sense of dread, Harriet recognized one as her father's. She crept to the door and opened it a crack, listening. I have every right to see my own daughter, George Gaines was saying, his voice slurring slightly. He'd been drinking, never a good sign. Not when you tried to sell her to Vernon Blackwell, came Martha's firm reply. The girl's resting, and I won't have you disturbing her. She's my flesh and blood. She has responsibilities to her family, like being traded for debt forgiveness. This new voice belonged to Marshal Calloway, and its coldness sent a shiver down Harriet's spine. That's not responsibility, Mr. Gaines, that's slavery. There was a tense silence, then her father's voice again, softer but no less angry. You don't understand our situation, Marshal. We're about to lose everything. Then lose it with dignity, the Marshal replied. Don't sacrifice your daughter to save your pride. Harriet couldn't stay hidden any longer. She descended the stairs, finding the three of them in the parlor, Martha standing like a sentinel before the staircase, her father red-faced with drink and anger, and Marshal Calloway watching him with the wary attention of a man expecting trouble. Father, Harriet said quietly. All three turned to look at her. Her father's expression shifted from anger to a calculating look that made her stomach turn. She'd seen that expression before when he was about to try manipulation instead of force. Harriet, my dear, he said, his voice suddenly gentle. Your mother is beside herself with worry. Come home with me now and we'll forget this unfortunate incident. And what about Mr. Blackwell? She asked. Will he forget it too? Her father hesitated. Vernon is a reasonable man. He understands that young women sometimes get cold feet. Vernon Blackwell is many things, but reasonable isn't one of them, Marshal Calloway interrupted. He's already sent men to your ranch, Gaines, not to check on your wife's welfare, but to remind you of your debt. Fear flashed across her father's face. All the more reason for Harriet to reconsider. He'll ruin us. So you'd rather he ruin your daughter's life instead? Martha asked, disgust evident in her voice. Harriet stepped forward, finding a calm she hadn't known she possessed. I'm not coming home, Father. Not now, perhaps not ever. Tell Mother I'm safe and that I love her. You ungrateful, her father lurched toward her, but Marshal Calloway moved between them with surprising speed. That's enough, he said, his voice low but commanding. Miss Gaines has made her decision. I suggest you respect it and leave. For a moment, it seemed George Gaines might try to push past the marshal. Then, muttering curses, he turned and stomped out of the boarding house. Harriet released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you both. Martha patted her shoulder. No thanks needed. That man needs a good talking to about what fatherhood means. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. Dinner will be ready soon. I'll leave you two to talk. When Martha had gone to the kitchen, an awkward silence fell between Harriet and the marshal. He cleared his throat. I brought your things, he said, gesturing to a small trunk and carpet bag near the door. Your mother packed them. She included a note. Harriet felt a rush of gratitude. Her mother at least understood. Thank you for getting them. It was no trouble, he hesitated. Miss Gaines, I should inform you that the situation with Blackwell is escalating. He's filed a complaint against me for interfering with a private contract. Can he do that? Harriet asked, alarmed. He can try. He's claiming your father signed a contract promising your hand in marriage in exchange for debt forgiveness. If such a document exists, it doesn't, Harriet said firmly. At least, I never signed anything, and I can't imagine my father would have put such an arrangement in writing. The marshal looked relieved. That's good. Without documentation, it becomes your word against his. And who would believe me over Vernon Blackwell in Socorro? Harriet asked bitterly. More people than you might think, Marshal Calloway replied. Blackwell has money and influence, but he's not well liked, and people respect courage, Miss Gaines. The way you stood up to him today has already become the talk of the town. Harriet hadn't considered that her actions might be seen as brave rather than scandalous. The thought was both empowering and terrifying. What happens now? Now, the marshal said, we build a case against Blackwell, not just for what he tried to do to you, but for all his other activities. I've been gathering evidence for months, but I need witnesses willing to testify. And you think I could help? I think you might be the key to convincing others to come forward. He studied her face. But I won't lie to you, it could be dangerous. Blackwell won't take this challenge to his authority lightly. Before Harriet could respond, Martha called everyone to dinner. The boarding house's other residents began filtering into the dining room, 2 schoolteachers, a widow working as a seamstress, and an elderly man who Harriet learned was a retired station master. They welcomed her warmly, tactfully avoiding direct questions about her dramatic arrival in a wedding dress. Marshal Calloway joined them for the meal, and Harriet observed how easily he conversed with everyone, showing genuine interest in their lives. He was a good listener, she realized, a rare quality in a man, especially one accustomed to authority. After dinner, he asked if she would walk with him on the porch, as he had more to discuss about her situation. The evening was cooling rapidly, the way desert nights did, and Harriet was grateful for the shawl Martha had lent her. I won't be staying at the boarding house tonight, the marshal told her as they stood looking at the emerging stars. I think it's best if I maintain a visible presence in town, let Blackwell's men see that I'm watching them. Where will you stay? Harriet asked, then immediately regretted the question. It wasn't her business. If he found the question presumptuous, he didn't show it. The sheriff has a cot in his office, not the most comfortable arrangement, but I've slept in worse places. Harriet nodded, wondering what those places might have been and what circumstances had led him there. You didn't come to Socorro just for Vernon Blackwell, did you? She asked suddenly. There's something personal about this for you. The marshal was silent for so long that Harriet thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was quiet, reflective. My younger sister was forced into marriage with a man like Blackwell back in Texas. A cattle baron who'd loaned money to our father after the war. What happened to her? Harriet asked softly. She died, he said simply. Officially, it was fever. Unofficially, he trailed off, his jaw tightening. By the time I returned from my first stint with the Rangers, it was too late. I couldn't prove anything, but I know what kind of man he was. What kind of men they all are those who see people as property. I'm so sorry, Harriet said, understanding now his determination to bring Blackwell to justice. He shook his head as if clearing away painful memories. It was a long time ago. But yes, when I heard about your situation, it felt familiar, too familiar to ignore. Impulsively, Harriet touched his arm. Thank you for stopping the wedding, whatever your reasons. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. For a moment, Harriet thought he might say more, or perhaps even take her hand. Instead, he stepped back slightly, returning to his professional demeanor. I should go, he said. Sheriff Jenkins will be wondering where I am, but I'll check on you tomorrow. In the meantime, stay close to the boarding house. Don't go anywhere alone. I understand, Harriet replied, trying not to show her disappointment at his withdrawal. Good night, Marshal Calloway. Good night, Miss Gaines. He hesitated, then added, and please call me Owen. With that, he tipped his hat and walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving Harriet with a strange mixture of fear and hope swirling in her heart. The next few days established a new routine for Harriet. She spent her mornings helping Martha with the boarding house chores, finding satisfaction in the simple, honest work. In the afternoons, she often accompanied one of the school teachers, Miss Abernathy, to the small Socorro library, where she devoured books on subjects her limited education had never covered. Owen, as she'd begun to think of him, though she still addressed him as Marshal in public, visited daily, sometimes just briefly to ensure her safety, other times staying longer to discuss developments in his investigation of Vernon Blackwell. These longer conversations often extended beyond the case, as they discovered shared interests in literature and surprisingly similar views on the changing frontier. A week after the interrupted wedding, Owen brought news that made Harriet's heart race with both fear and anticipation. We've found witnesses, he told her as they sat in Martha's small garden. 3 ranchers willing to testify that Blackwell threatened them, plus a former ranch hand who says he was ordered to poison a neighbor's cattle when they refused to sell their water rights. That's wonderful, Harriet said, but why do you look so concerned? Because this means we're moving forward with formal charges, Owen explained. There will be a hearing before the circuit judge arrives next week, and Blackwell knows it's coming. You think he'll try something desperate, Harriet guessed. Owen nodded. Men like him are most dangerous when cornered. I've arranged for additional protection for all the witnesses, including you. Me, but I haven't agreed to testify yet. You don't have to, Owen assured her quickly. But Blackwell may assume you will. Either way, you're a living symbol of his public humiliation. That makes you a target. The thought sent a chill through Harriet. She'd been so focused on her newfound freedom that she'd almost forgotten the danger still lurking. What should I do? Stay vigilant, don't go anywhere alone, and, he hesitated. I've been thinking it might be best if you left Socorro, at least until after the hearing. The suggestion struck Harriet like a physical blow. Leave, but where would I go? My sister-in-law runs a boarding house in Santa Fe. She'd take you in, no questions asked. Your sister-in-law. This was the first Harriet had heard of Owen having any family besides his deceased sister. My brother's widow, he clarified. James died during the war. Alina remarried eventually, but we've stayed close. Harriet considered the offer, tempted by the promise of safety but reluctant to flee. If I leave, won't that look like I'm afraid? Like Blackwell has won? Owen's expression softened. There's no shame in ensuring your safety, Harriet. Courage doesn't always mean standing your ground. Sometimes it means living to fight another day. She appreciated his concern, but something inside her rebelled at the thought of running away. Let me think about it, she said finally. Owen nodded, though she could see he was disappointed by her hesitation. Of course, it's your decision. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Jenkins, his expression grim. We've got trouble, Owen. 2 of Blackwell's men just rode into town, heavily armed. They're asking after Miss Gaines. Owen was on his feet instantly. Where are they now? Saloon. Drinking and making threats. Stay here, Owen told Harriet firmly. Martha knows what to do if there's trouble. Before she could protest, both men were gone, leaving her with a mixture of frustration and fear. She hated feeling helpless, being protected like some delicate flower unable to face the world's dangers. Yet what could she do against armed men? Martha appeared in the doorway, a shotgun in her capable hands. "Come inside, dear. Best not to tempt fate." Reluctantly, Harriet followed her inside, where Martha proceeded to lock all the doors and close the shutters. "My brother taught me long ago to be prepared," she explained, checking that the shotgun was loaded. "Men like Blackwell don't play by civilized rules." "It seems unfair that we should have to hide while they roam freely," Harriet observed, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Life's rarely fair, especially for women," Martha replied pragmatically. "But there's a difference between hiding and being strategic." She handed Harriet a small revolver. "Know how to use one of these?" Harriet stared at the weapon. "My father taught me the basics when I was younger, before he started drinking so heavily." "Good. I don't expect trouble to find us here, but if it does, I don't intend for us to be helpless victims." The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. The other boarders returned and were quickly ushered inside and informed of the situation. Miss Abernathy, the younger of the two schoolteachers, seemed almost excited by the drama, while Mr. Patterson, the elderly station master, grumbled about outlaws running decent folks indoors. It was nearly dusk when they heard horses approaching. Martha positioned herself by the window, shotgun ready. "It's the marshal," she announced with evident relief. Harriet rushed to open the door, her concern for Owen's safety overriding propriety. He looked tired but unharmed. Sheriff Jenkins stood behind him, sporting what would clearly become an impressive black eye. "What happened?" Harriet demanded. "Blackwell's men got rowdy," Owen explained, stepping inside. "We persuaded them that Socorro wasn't a healthy place for them to linger." "Persuaded?" Martha raised an eyebrow at her brother's bruised face. "With the necessary emphasis," the sheriff confirmed dryly. "They'll think twice before coming back." Owen turned to Harriet. "This incident confirms my concerns. Blackwell is getting desperate. I really think you should consider leaving town until the hearing." Before Harriet could respond, there was a commotion outside, the sound of a wagon approaching at high speed. They all tensed, but Owen relaxed as he glanced out the window. "It's your mother," he told Harriet. Surprised and concerned, Harriet hurried outside. The wagon pulled up in front of the boarding house, her mother at the reins looking disheveled and frightened. "Mother, what's wrong?" Harriet helped the older woman down from the wagon. Elizabeth Gaines clutched her daughter's hands. "It's your father. Vernon's men came to the ranch. They said if you didn't return and agree to the marriage, they'd burn us out. Your father tried to stand up to them and—" She broke down in tears. "Is he hurt?" Harriet asked, her heart pounding. "They beat him badly," her mother confirmed. "He's with Doc Wilson now, but they said they'd be back tomorrow, and next time they wouldn't be so gentle." Owen had joined them, his expression darkening as he heard Mrs. Gaines's account. "This changes things," he said grimly. "Blackwell's escalating beyond threats now." "I have to go back," Harriet said immediately. "I can't let them hurt my family because of me." "That's exactly what Blackwell wants," Owen countered. "If you go back, he wins, and once he has you, there's nothing to stop him from carrying out his threats anyway." "Then what do you suggest?" Harriet demanded, frustration and fear making her voice sharp. Owen thought for a moment. "We bring your parents here where we can protect them, and we accelerate our timeline. I'll wire the circuit judge tonight, ask him to arrive earlier for the hearing. And if he can't, then we'll find another way," Owen promised. "But surrendering to Blackwell is not an option I'm willing to consider." The determination in his voice steadied Harriet. She turned to her mother. "Will you stay here tonight? Martha has room." Elizabeth Gaines nodded wearily. "I can't go back there alone, not with those men watching the ranch. Tomorrow we'll bring Father here too once he's well enough to be moved," Harriet decided. Owen squeezed her shoulder gently. "I'll arrange an escort to the doctor's office first thing in the morning." His eyes met hers, conveying both reassurance and something deeper, something neither of them was ready to name. That night, Harriet lay awake long after the boarding house had fallen silent. Her mind raced with fears and possibilities. She'd never imagined her rejection of Vernon Blackwell would lead to such danger for her family. Was she being selfish in standing her ground, or would surrendering only embolden a tyrant? And then there was Owen. In just a week, he'd become central to her thoughts in a way no man ever had. She admired his principles, his courage, the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station. But she wasn't naive enough to think his interest in her case was entirely professional anymore. She'd caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, seen the way his expression softened when they spoke. It was dangerous to let her heart follow this path. Once Blackwell was dealt with, Owen would move on to his next assignment, U.S. Marshals didn't put down roots. Their duty called them wherever lawlessness needed to be confronted. Morning brought gray skies and a tension that seemed to hang over Socorro like the threat of a storm. Owen arrived early, accompanied by 2 deputies Sheriff Jenkins had deputized specifically to help protect the witnesses against Blackwell. "I've sent word to the circuit judge," Owen told Harriet as they prepared to visit her father at the doctor's office. "With luck, he'll arrive within 3 days. And if Blackwell makes good on his threats before then," Harriet asked, securing her borrowed shawl against the unusual chill. "We'll be ready," Owen promised. "Sheriff Jenkins has organized a town watch. Blackwell may have money, but he's running out of friends in Socorro." The doctor's small office was crowded when they arrived. George Gaines lay on an examination table, his face bruised almost beyond recognition, his breathing labored. Doc Wilson, a thin, precise man with spectacles perched on his nose, was just finishing changing the bandages on Mr. Gaines's ribs. "Harriet," her father croaked when he saw her. Gone was the blustering anger of their last meeting, replaced by a broken vulnerability that made Harriet's heart ache despite everything. "I'm here, father," she said, moving to his side. "How is he, doctor?" 3 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and enough bruising to make breathing painful for weeks, Doc Wilson reported matter-of-factly. "But he'll live. Whether he'll learn anything from the experience remains to be seen." George Gaines managed a weak smile. "I've learned that Vernon Blackwell is not a man of his word. You're just realizing this now." Harriet couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Her father closed his eyes briefly. "I was a fool, desperate and proud, I thought." He coughed painfully. "I thought I could protect our home, our legacy. Instead, I nearly sacrificed something far more precious." It was as close to an apology as George Gaines had ever offered, and Harriet felt tears pricking her eyes. "We're going to move you to the boarding house," she told him. "You'll be safer there." Her father didn't argue, another sign of how drastically circumstances had changed. With careful assistance from Owen and one of the deputies, they managed to transfer George to a wagon, making him as comfortable as possible for the short journey. As they emerged from the doctor's office, Harriet noticed the street was unusually empty for mid-morning. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional slam of a door or shutter as townsfolk secured their businesses. "Something's wrong," Owen said quietly, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. No sooner had he spoken than the sound of multiple horses reached them, coming from the north end of town. Owen motioned for the deputy to continue with the wagon. "Get them to the boarding house," he ordered. "I'll find out what's happening." "I'm coming with you," Harriet said firmly. Owen looked like he wanted to argue but must have recognized the determination in her expression. "Stay close to me," he relented. They moved quickly toward the main street, where they found Sheriff Jenkins and several deputies positioning themselves strategically. The cause of their concern soon became apparent. At least a dozen riders were approaching, Vernon Blackwell unmistakable at their head. "What's he doing?" Harriet whispered, fear tightening her chest. "Making a show of force," Owen replied grimly, "trying to intimidate the town." The riders drew to a halt in the center of the street. Vernon, dressed in an expensive black suit that made him look like a well-heeled undertaker, surveyed the armed men facing him with contemptuous amusement. "Quite the welcome committee, Sheriff," he called out. "Anyone would think Socorro was preparing for war." "Just maintaining the peace, Blackwell," Sheriff Jenkins replied evenly. "Something that might be easier if you didn't bring an army into my town." "These are merely my employees," Vernon said, gesturing to the hard-faced men surrounding him. "We're here on business." Owen stepped forward. What kind of business requires this many armed men? Vernon's eyes narrowed as he recognized the marshal. Ah, the heroic lawman who interfered in a private arrangement between gentlemen. His gaze shifted to Harriet, and his expression turned ugly. And the ungrateful bride who seems to have forgotten her family obligations. The only obligation my family has to you is to see you brought to justice, Harriet retorted, surprised by her own boldness. Vernon laughed, the sound devoid of humor. Justice. In this territory, justice is whatever the man with the most money says it is. He turned his attention back to Owen. I understand you've been gathering witnesses against me, Marshal. A foolish waste of time. The circuit judge might disagree, Owen replied calmly. He'll be here in 3 days for a formal hearing. Something flickered across Vernon's face, surprise, perhaps, or concern before his arrogant mask returned. 3 days is a long time. Much can happen. Witnesses can change their minds or disappear. Is that a threat, Blackwell? Sheriff Jenkins demanded, merely an observation. Vernon surveyed the town with exaggerated interest. Socorro has always been prone to unfortunate accidents. Remember that fire last summer? Half of Main Street gone in an hour. Such a tragedy. The implication was clear, and Harriet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the overcast day. Vernon was threatening to burn the town if he didn't get his way. Owen moved slightly, positioning himself more directly between Harriet and Blackwell. You're playing a dangerous game, he warned. Threatening a U.S. Marshal and interfering with federal witnesses adds years to a prison sentence. Vernon's smile never wavered. Threats? I've made no threats. I'm simply reminiscing about local history. He gathered his reins. We'll be staying at my property just outside town. I look forward to this hearing. It should prove most educational for everyone involved. With that, he signaled to his men, and they wheeled their horses around, riding toward the south end of town at an unhurried pace that somehow made their departure even more menacing than their arrival. As the tension eased slightly, Harriet realized she'd been holding her breath. He's planning something, she said quietly. Owen nodded, his expression grim. 3 days is a long time to keep everyone safe. Sheriff Jenkins joined them, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool day. We don't have enough men to guard every witness and patrol the town. Then we need to consolidate, Owen decided. Bring everyone to one location where we can protect them more effectively. The church, the sheriff suggested. It's stone, less vulnerable to fire. Owen considered this. Too obvious and too close to the center of town. He thought for a moment. What about the old fort outside town? It's abandoned but still defensible. It's been empty for years, Jenkins cautioned. No amenities to speak of. Better uncomfortable than dead, Owen replied bluntly. How quickly can we move everyone? As the men discussed logistics, Harriet's mind raced. Vernon Blackwell was willing to threaten an entire town just to force her compliance. The knowledge was both terrifying and infuriating. She refused to let fear rule her, yet she couldn't ignore the danger to innocent people. I should talk to him, she said suddenly, interrupting the men's planning. They both turned to stare at her. Absolutely not, Owen said firmly. Hear me out, Harriet insisted. If I meet with him in public, with witnesses, maybe I can buy us time, convince him I'm considering his offer. He's not a man who can be reasoned with, Owen argued, and I won't risk your safety. It's not just about my safety anymore, Harriet countered. He's threatening the entire town. At least this way we might distract him while you move the witnesses to safety. Owen looked like he wanted to continue arguing, but Sheriff Jenkins placed a hand on his arm. She has a point, Owen. We need time. The marshal's jaw tightened with frustration. If we consider this plan, it would be under strict conditions. Public location, armed guards nearby, limited time. Agreed, Harriet said quickly, before he could change his mind. Owen's eyes held hers, concern and admiration warring in their gray depths. You're either the bravest or most foolhardy woman I've ever met, Harriet Gaines. Perhaps both, she admitted with a small smile, but I won't let Vernon Blackwell destroy this town because of me. The plan came together quickly. Harriet would meet Vernon the following morning at the hotel restaurant, the most public venue in Socorro. She would pretend to consider his proposal while subtly gathering information about his intentions. Meanwhile, Owen and Sheriff Jenkins would use the distraction to move the witnesses and Harriet's parents to the abandoned fort. That evening, as final preparations were being made, Owen found Harriet alone on the boarding house porch. She was watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, trying to calm her nerves about the next day's deception. "You don't have to do this," Owen said without preamble, leaning against the porch railing beside her. "I know," she replied, "but I want to help." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Finally, Owen turned to face her. "When this is over," he said hesitantly, "when Blackwell is behind bars and you're safe, I'd like to talk about what happens next." Harriet's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Owen took a deep breath, "that I've come to care for you, Harriet, more than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances." She looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his usual composure. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted softly. Owen reached for her hand, his touch gentle but tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. "I know a marshal's life isn't what most women would choose, always moving, never settled." But Harriet placed her fingers against his lips, stopping his words. "Let's focus on surviving the next few days. Then we can talk about possibilities." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then, with a care that made Harriet's heart ache, he bent and pressed his lips to hers, a brief, sweet kiss that promised more but asked nothing. When they parted, Harriet felt a certainty settle over her. Whatever happened with Vernon Blackwell, whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them. For the chance at a future with this man, she would risk everything. Morning arrived with an oppressive heat that belied the previous day's coolness. Harriet dressed with care in her most presentable outfit, a blue calico dress that Martha had altered to fit her perfectly. Her hair she arranged simply but neatly, refusing to make any special effort for Vernon Blackwell. Owen escorted her to the hotel, his face set in tense lines. "Remember the signals we agreed on," he reminded her. "If you feel threatened in any way, I'll adjust my shawl and you'll create a diversion," Harriet recited patiently. "I remember, Owen." At the hotel entrance, he paused. "I'll be watching from across the street. Sheriff Jenkins has men positioned inside the restaurant. You're not alone in this." "I know," Harriet said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Now go before someone notices you." With obvious reluctance, Owen crossed the street to the sheriff's office, where he would have a clear view of the hotel restaurant through the window. Harriet took a deep breath and entered the hotel. Vernon Blackwell was already seated at a table near the window, impeccably dressed as always. He rose when he saw her, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Miss Gaines, I'm pleased you accepted my invitation." "Mr. Blackwell," Harriet acknowledged, allowing him to pull out her chair. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she forced herself to sit calmly. A waiter appeared immediately with coffee. Vernon must have arranged for prompt service, another display of his influence in Socorro. "I must admit, I was surprised by your note," Vernon said, studying her over the rim of his cup. "After your dramatic rejection, I had assumed you were quite determined in your opposition to our arrangement." Harriet had prepared for this. "Recent events have forced me to reconsider my position," she said carefully. "My father's injuries, the threats to my family's property. I wonder if my personal happiness is worth such a cost." Vernon's expression remained calculating. "A mature perspective, though I find myself curious about this sudden change of heart. Is it so surprising that I would want to protect my family? Not at all. Family loyalty is admirable." Vernon leaned forward slightly. "But I wonder if your association with Marshal Calloway might be a factor in this meeting." Harriet's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't understand." "Come now, Miss Gaines, I have eyes throughout Socorro. The Marshal's interest in you appears to extend beyond professional concern." "Marshal Calloway is simply doing his job," Harriet replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Vernon smiled thinly. "If you say so. But should you decide to accept my proposal, I would expect absolute loyalty, including an immediate end to any friendship with the Marshal." The possessiveness in his tone made Harriet's skin crawl. She forced herself to nod non-committally. "If I were to consider your offer, What assurances would I have regarding my family's safety and financial security? Vernon seemed pleased by her apparent capitulation. Your father's debts would be forgiven, of course. I would also ensure that your parents could remain on their ranch for the remainder of their lives. And the allegations against you. The witnesses prepared to testify about your business practices. A flash of anger crossed Vernon's face before he controlled it. A collection of lies from jealous competitors. After our marriage, I would naturally expect you to support your husband's reputation by contradicting the witnesses. Harriet pressed, sensing an opportunity to gather information. By standing beside me as a loyal wife should, Vernon countered smoothly. Though I doubt the issue will arise, I've found that witnesses often reconsider their testimony when their own interests are at stake. The threat was unmistakable, confirming Owen's suspicions that Vernon planned to intimidate or harm the witnesses before the hearing. Harriet adjusted her shawl slightly, their agreed signal that she had obtained useful information. I see, she said, buying time. And when would you expect this marriage to take place? Immediately, Vernon replied without hesitation. Today, in fact, I've already arranged for the pastor to be available this afternoon. Harriet nearly choked on her coffee. Today, that's rather sudden. I'm not a man who believes in unnecessary delays. Vernon's eyes hardened. Especially when there are those who might try to interfere if given the opportunity. Harriet realized with growing alarm that Vernon had no intention of letting her leave the hotel unmarried. This meeting wasn't a negotiation, it was a trap. She adjusted her shawl again, more urgently this time. As if on cue, a commotion erupted on the street outside. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew Vernon's attention to the window. Outside, a wagon had apparently lost a wheel, blocking the street directly in front of the hotel. Owen was nowhere to be seen, but Harriet recognized the diversion for what it was. A moment, Mr. Blackwell, she said, rising from her chair. I need to visit the ladies' retiring room before we continue our discussion. Vernon frowned but nodded, his attention still partially on the scene outside. Don't be long, we have much to arrange. Harriet walked calmly toward the back of the restaurant, then slipped through the kitchen and out the service entrance. Owen was waiting in the alley, mounted on his horse with a second animal ready for her. It's a trap, she told him breathlessly as he helped her mount. He plans to force the marriage today. I guessed as much when I saw two of his men position themselves at the hotel exits, Owen replied grimly. Did you learn anything about his plans for the witnesses? Only that he intends to ensure they don't testify. He didn't give specifics, but the threat was clear. They rode quickly toward the edge of town, taking back streets to avoid being seen. Harriet glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Vernon's men in pursuit. Where are we going? She asked. The abandoned fort, Owen explained. Sheriff Jenkins has already moved your parents and the other witnesses there. It's the safest place until the circuit judge arrives. They had just cleared the last buildings of Socorro when the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Owen cursed under his breath. They've discovered you're missing. Hold on. They spurred their horses to a gallop, racing across the open desert toward a low mesa in the distance. Harriet clung to her saddle, the wind whipping her hair free from its pins. Despite the danger, she felt a strange exhilaration. She was fighting back, no longer a passive victim of Vernon Blackwell's machinations. The old fort came into view, a square stone structure built decades earlier, when Apache raids had been common in the territory. Its walls were weathered but solid, offering protection against both elements and enemies. Several horses were tethered in what had once been a parade ground, and Harriet recognized her father's wagon among them. They've arrived safely, Owen said with evident relief as they rode through the arched entrance. Inside, the fort's central courtyard bustled with activity as Sheriff Jenkins and his deputies organized defenses and settled the witnesses into the old barracks. Harriet dismounted quickly, searching for her parents. She found them in what had once been the commander's quarters, a small but solid room with a fireplace and actual furniture, unlike the Spartan accommodations elsewhere in the fort. Harriet, her mother exclaimed, embracing her. We were so worried when they brought us here without you. I'm fine, Mother, Harriet assured her, then turned to her father, who sat propped up in a chair, his injuries still evident but his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "How are you feeling, father?" "Like a fool," George Gaines replied bluntly, "but a wiser one than I was a week ago." He reached for her hand. "I should never have tried to force you into that marriage, Harriet. Can you forgive an old man's pride and desperation?" The simple apology, so long in coming, brought tears to Harriet's eyes. "Yes, father, I can." Their reconciliation was interrupted by Owen's arrival. "Blackwell and his men are on their way," he announced. "Everyone needs to prepare for a potential siege." Elizabeth Gaines repeated, alarmed. "Surely he wouldn't attack a fort full of people. A week ago, I might have agreed with you," Owen replied grimly. "But Blackwell is desperate now. The circuit judge will be here by tomorrow afternoon." Once the hearing begins, Blackwell loses control of the situation. "How many men does he have?" George asked, his rancher's practicality asserting itself. "At least 15 that we've counted," Owen said. "We have 8 deputies plus myself and the sheriff." "And some of the witnesses are handy with firearms," Harriet thought quickly. "What about sending for help from neighboring towns?" Owen nodded approvingly. "Already done. Sheriff Jenkins dispatched riders to Albuquerque and Los Lunas as soon as we decided to move everyone here. But it will take time for reinforcements to arrive. Then we need to hold out until they do," Harriet concluded. "Or until the circuit judge arrives," Owen added. Blackwell might be willing to threaten local law enforcement, but attacking a federal judge would bring the full weight of the territorial government down on him. The sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Owen moved to the window, his expression tightening as he surveyed the scene. "They're here, at least 20 men now." Harriet joined him at the window. Vernon sat atop his black horse at the head of his small army, his face a mask of cold fury as he surveyed the fort. "Marshal Calloway," he shouted, "I know you're in there with my bride. Send her out and we can end this peacefully." Owen's hand moved instinctively to his holstered pistol. "His bride," he muttered. "The man's delusions know no bounds." Sheriff Jenkins appeared in the doorway. "Blackwell's demanding we surrender the witnesses and Miss Gaines. Says he'll let the rest of us ride out unharmed if we do." "And you believe him?" Owen asked incredulously. "Of course not," Jenkins snorted. "Just relaying the message." Owen thought for a moment. "We need to stall him, buy time for reinforcements to arrive." He turned to Harriet. "Would you be willing to speak with him? From the safety of the walls, of course. Keep him talking." Harriet nodded, despite the fear twisting in her stomach. "If it will help." They moved to the fort's upper level, where a walkway ran along the interior of the stone walls. Carefully staying behind the protection of the parapet, Harriet called out to Vernon, "Mr. Blackwell, this has gone far enough." Vernon guided his horse closer to the fort. "Harriet, I'm relieved to see you unharmed. These men have abducted you against your will." "No one has abducted me," Harriet replied clearly. "I came here of my own free choice to escape being forced into marriage. We had an agreement," Vernon insisted, his facade of concern slipping. "Your father promised you to me in exchange for settling his debts." "My father had no right to make such a promise," Harriet countered. "And you had no right to accept it. Women are not property to be traded, Mr. Blackwell." Vernon's expression darkened. "This defiance is unbecoming, Harriet. I've been patient, but my patience has limits." "As does the law," Owen interjected, stepping up beside Harriet. "The circuit judge will be here tomorrow, Blackwell. Whatever happens today, you'll face justice for your actions." "Justice?" Vernon laughed bitterly. "In this territory, justice is bought and paid for. Something you should understand, Marshal, given your own personal interests in this matter." "What are you implying?" Owen demanded. "Merely that your pursuit of me seems motivated by more than professional duty," Vernon replied with a knowing smirk. "Your affection for Miss Gaines is hardly a secret in Socorro." Harriet felt her cheeks warm but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Blackwell, the Marshal's feelings are irrelevant. The fact remains that you've threatened witnesses, ordered men beaten, and now you're besieging a fort. Do you really believe these actions will go unpunished?" "I believe in being practical," Vernon replied coldly. "And practically speaking, not everyone in that fort needs to die today, only those who insist on testifying against me." He raised his voice to address the fort at large. Anyone who wishes to leave peacefully may do so now. I have no quarrel with those who mind their own business." A tense silence followed his offer. Owen and Harriet exchanged glances, wondering if any of the witnesses might waver. But the fort remained united, no one stepping forward to accept Vernon's terms. Frustrated by this show of solidarity, Vernon called to his men. "Surround the fort. No one enters or leaves until I have what I came for." As Vernon's men took up positions around the perimeter, Owen led Harriet back down to the courtyard. "You did well," he told her. "The longer we keep him talking, the better our chances." "What if reinforcements don't arrive in time?" Harriet asked. "Then we defend this position," Owen replied simply. "The fort was built to withstand attacks. We have water, some provisions, and enough ammunition to make any assault costly for Blackwell." Sheriff Jenkins joined them, his expression grim but determined. "I've stationed men at all vulnerable points. If they try to scale the walls or break through the gate, they'll meet resistance." "Good," Owen approved. "What about water and food?" "Enough for 2 days, maybe 3 if we're careful," Jenkins reported. "The old well still works, thankfully." As the day progressed into evening, an uneasy stalemate developed. Vernon's men maintained their positions around the fort, occasionally firing shots that seemed designed more to fray nerves than to cause harm. Inside, the defenders rotated watches, conserved resources, and waited. Harriet found herself unable to rest, moving from position to position within the fort, offering water to the deputies and encouragement to the nervous witnesses. As night fell, she made her way to the western wall, where Owen stood watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues. "Any sign of reinforcements?" she asked, joining him at the parapet. "Not yet," Owen admitted, "but they could arrive by morning." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the beauty of the desert evening a stark contrast to their precarious situation. "What will happen after?" Harriet asked quietly. "If we survive this, if Vernon is arrested, what then?" Owen turned to face her, his expression softening. "That depends on you, Harriet. I meant what I said last night. When this is over, I'd like to explore possibilities, even though your duty will take you elsewhere." Harriet pressed. She needed to know where she stood, what she might be risking her heart for. "My assignment in this region isn't finished," Owen said carefully. "Even after Blackwell, there's work to be done. And—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "If there were someone worth staying for, I might consider requesting a more permanent posting in the territory." Harriet's heart quickened at his implication. "Someone like me." "Exactly like you," Owen confirmed, his eyes never leaving hers. "If that's what you want." Before Harriet could respond, a shout from the eastern wall interrupted them. Riders approaching from the east, they rushed to see, hearts pounding with hope that reinforcements had arrived. But as the riders came into view in the fading light, Owen's expression turned to one of concern. "Those aren't lawmen," he said grimly. "That's the rest of Blackwell's crew from his ranch." Harriet felt her hopes sink. "How many?" "At least 10 more," Owen estimated. "This changes things." With these numbers, Blackwell might feel confident enough to attempt a direct assault. As if confirming Owen's assessment, Vernon's voice rang out in the gathering darkness. "Marshal Calloway, your position has become untenable. Surrender the witnesses and Harriet Gaines by dawn, or we will take the fort by force." "He's bluffing," Harriet insisted, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Owen wasn't so sure. "With 30 men, he could mount a serious attack. We need to prepare for that possibility." They spent the night strengthening defenses and distributing the limited firearms among those capable of using them. Harriet insisted on taking a watch rotation despite Owen's initial reluctance. "I can shoot as well as half the men here," she pointed out when he tried to dissuade her. "And it's my future at stake too." Dawn broke with an eerie calm. Vernon's men had been quiet for the past few hours, conserving energy for whatever came next. Inside the fort, defenders took their positions, weapons ready. Harriet found herself stationed next to her father, who had insisted on helping despite his injuries. He handled his old rifle with the ease of long practice, checking the action methodically. "I never thought we'd be fighting side by side," Harriet observed. George Gaines smiled ruefully. I never thought I'd be fighting against the man I tried to make your husband. He shook his head. I was blind, Harriet, blind and foolish. Why did you agree to his proposal in the first place? Harriet asked, a question that had burned within her for months. Her father sighed heavily. It started with a loan after last year's drought, then another. Before I knew it, I owed him more than the ranch was worth, when he suggested wiping the debt clean in exchange for your hand. He looked away, ashamed. It seemed like the only way to save the family legacy. The ranch means that much to you. I thought it did, George admitted. Now I realize what I was really trying to save was my pride, and I nearly sacrificed something infinitely more valuable to do it. Their conversation was interrupted by Vernon's voice, amplified in the morning stillness. Marshal Calloway, your time has expired. What is your answer? Owen stood on the wall, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. We reject your ultimatum, Blackwell. The witnesses remain under the protection of the law, then their blood is on your hands, Vernon shouted back. He signaled to his men, who began moving toward the fort with clear intent. Here they come, Owen called to the defenders. Hold your fire until they're in range. The assault began with a volley of gunfire from Vernon's men, bullets pinging off stone walls and forcing the defenders to duck behind the parapets. Then, under covering fire, a group of attackers rushed the main gate with what appeared to be a makeshift battering ram, a fallen tree trunk carried by 6 men. Concentrate fire on the ram team, Owen ordered. Rifles cracked from the fort walls. 2 of Vernon's men fell, but the others continued their charge, reaching the gate and beginning to pound against the heavy wood. The gate won't hold for long, Sheriff Jenkins shouted. Owen made a quick decision. Jenkins, take 5 men and hold the courtyard. Everyone else, maintain fire from the walls. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Vernon's superior numbers were beginning to tell, as the defenders struggled to cover all approaches to the fort. The battering ram continued to thunder against the gate, each impact splintering the aging wood a little more. Suddenly, from the south, a new sound cut through the chaos, a bugle call, clear and commanding. All heads turned to see a dust cloud approaching rapidly, resolving into a column of uniformed men on horseback. U.S. cavalry soldiers, at least 20 strong, led by a rider who could only be the circuit judge. Reinforcements, Harriet cried, relief flooding through her. The effect on Vernon's men was immediate. Several broke off their attack, running for their horses. Others stood uncertainly, looking to their employer for direction. Vernon himself seemed frozen in disbelief, watching as his advantage evaporated. Then, with a cry of rage, he drew his pistol and aimed directly at Owen, who stood exposed on the wall. Owen, Harriet screamed in warning. Owen ducked as Vernon's shot whistled over his head. He returned fire with practiced precision, his bullet catching Vernon in the shoulder and spinning him around. The cavalry thundered into the area surrounding the fort, quickly surrounding Vernon's remaining men, who surrendered without further resistance. Vernon himself was dragged from his horse, clutching his bleeding shoulder and cursing as soldiers secured him. The fort gates swung open, and the defenders emerged cautiously, scarcely believing their ordeal was over. The circuit judge, a distinguished-looking man with iron-gray hair and a stern countenance, dismounted and approached Owen. Marshal Calloway, he acknowledged. It seems I arrived at an opportune moment. Indeed you did, Your Honor, Owen agreed fervently. We were beginning to think we'd have to hold out another day. When I received your urgent message, I pushed my escort to make all possible speed, the judge explained. It appears the situation was even more dire than you described. Vernon, being treated by a cavalry medic, glared at them with undisguised hatred. This changes nothing, he spat. You have no proof of wrongdoing, only the word of a few disgruntled ranchers and a woman who broke her promise. The judge regarded him coldly. Mr. Blackwell, you have been caught leading an armed assault against law enforcement officers and federal witnesses. That alone is enough to send you to prison for many years. He turned to Owen. I assume you have documentation of the other allegations, Owen nodded. Extensive, Your Honor. Financial records showing fraudulent loans, statements from victims of extortion, evidence of land grabbed through intimidation and violence. Then we will proceed with a formal hearing tomorrow, the judge decided. For now, Mr. Blackwell will remain in military custody. As Vernon was led away, Harriet found herself surrounded by her parents, both embracing her with relief and pride. "You were magnificent," her mother whispered. "So brave, we all were," Harriet replied, her eyes seeking Owen in the crowd. She found him speaking with the sheriff, his expression weary but triumphant. When he saw her looking, he excused himself and came to her side. "It's over," he said simply, taking her hands in his. "Thanks to you," Harriet replied. "You never gave up." "Neither did you," Owen pointed out. "You stood your ground when most would have surrendered." Around them, the fort courtyard buzzed with activity as soldiers and townsfolk mingled, recounting the siege and celebrating their narrow escape. No one paid much attention to the marshal and the young woman whose quiet conversation seemed to exist in a world of its own. "About those possibilities we discussed," Harriet began hesitantly, "I've been thinking." Owen's expression grew serious. "Yes. A marshal's wife would need to be strong," Harriet mused. "Independent enough to manage when duty calls him away, brave enough to face dangers at his side when necessary." "She would," Owen agreed, a smile beginning to tug at the corners of his mouth as he realized where this was heading. "It wouldn't be an easy life." "I've never wanted an easy life," Harriet replied. "Only a meaningful one with someone I could respect and love." She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. "Someone like you, Owen Calloway." His smile bloomed fully now, transforming his face and making Harriet's heart skip a beat. "Harriet Gaines, are you proposing to me?" "I believe I am," she confirmed, surprising herself with her boldness. "Unless you'd rather do the honors." Owen laughed, a sound of pure joy that drew curious glances from those nearby. "I would indeed." He kept hold of her hands but dropped to one knee before her, heedless of the dusty courtyard. "Harriet Gaines, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Not because anyone arranged it, but because we choose each other freely and completely." "Yes," Harriet said, tears of happiness spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, I will." As Owen rose and pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of adventure and love, Harriet marveled at the strange path that had brought her here. A month ago, she had faced a forced marriage to a man she despised. Now she embraced a future with a man she adored, a future she had helped forge through her own courage and determination. The wedding took place 3 months later in Socorro's small church, the same building where Harriet had nearly been forced to marry Vernon Blackwell, now transformed with wildflowers and ribbons into a place of genuine celebration. The entire town turned out for the occasion, along with visitors from surrounding communities who had heard the now famous story of the bride who refused to be sold and the marshal who had stood beside her. Vernon Blackwell was serving the first months of what would be a 15-year sentence in the territorial prison. His financial empire had crumbled as his illegal activities came to light, with many of his properties returned to their rightful owners, including the debt that had threatened the Gaines ranch. As Harriet walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she wore a simple but elegant white dress of her own choosing. Owen waited for her at the altar, his usually stern face transformed by a smile of such tenderness that it brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened frontiersmen present. "You look beautiful," he whispered as she joined him before the pastor. "And you look like everything I've ever wanted," she replied softly. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love and honor each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed her with a gentle passion that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Harriet and Owen moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends old and new. "So, Mrs. Calloway," Owen said as they finally claimed a moment alone on the church porch, "are you ready for our adventure?" Owen had accepted a permanent posting in Santa Fe, where they would make their home while he continued his work bringing law to the territory. Harriet had already arranged to assist at a school there, putting her love of books and learning to good use. "More than ready," Harriet assured him, leaning into his embrace. Though I must admit, after everything we've been through, a little peace and quiet might be welcome for a while. Owen laughed, the sound warming her heart as it always did. I'll do my best, though I can't make any promises. Life with a marshal is rarely predictable. That's what I'm counting on, Harriet replied with a smile. After all, predictable is highly overrated. As they gazed out at the sunset, painting the Socorro landscape in gold and crimson, Harriet reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From a reluctant bride being dragged to a wedding she dreaded, to a woman who had found not just freedom but true partnership with a man who valued her courage and spirit. "What are you thinking about?" Owen asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About how endings become beginnings," Harriet replied, "and how sometimes the words 'this wedding's over' can be the start of the most beautiful story." Owen's arms tightened around her. "Our story," he murmured against her hair. "Yes," Harriet agreed, turning in his embrace to face the future they would build together. "Ours."